Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you here in the room with us today, those of you joining us virtually as the event is being live streamed. It's a special day. We're not here to talk about US politics, which may be on the minds of many of you here. Although today's US election results will have far-reaching impacts, probably, I suspect, also on the topic we are here to talk about today. I don't know to what extent we'll get into that on the panel, but we're here to talk about minimizing risks from carbon capture and storage and the governance mechanisms needed for that here in Europe. My name is Sonja van Rensen, and I recently joined Carbon Pulse as their head of strategy. I've been a climate, energy and environment journalist in Brussels for the past 15 years. And I can remember CCS from 15 years ago, and well, it's back on the agenda, and it seems to be experiencing something of an upsurge in interest and attention from policymakers, from industry, probably due to a combination of things: net zero, which the net zero ambition didn't exist all those years ago. Industrial abatement, what to do with hard-to-abate industries, carbon removals, the concept also didn't exist in the past, and then other developments like low-carbon hydrogen, potentially, for example. So there's a new study at the heart of today's discussion, and we're going to have a presentation of that in a moment, and after that, a panel debate to get some reactions to it, notably on the kinds of risks that storage poses, the challenges, and also, therefore, what type of governance measures might be useful and should accompany Ursula von der Leyen's ambition to scale up investment in CO2 transport and storage. We've got a whole bunch of questions, but we'd very much welcome your questions and contributions as well, both those of you here in the room and those of you joining us virtually. You can send in questions through the channel you're watching this on. So please do send those across to us. Before we go into the presentation, I'm going to hand over to Thomas Legge to give us a bit of an introduction to today. So Thomas is the director of European Climate Foundation's Land Use Programme, normally based in Berlin, today here with us in Brussels. So his focus is on land and agriculture, food and so forth. And inevitably, that links through to carbon removal, which is, at least for me, how I would make the link to today's carbon storage topic. He's been with ECF for over 10 years now, and previously also worked here in Brussels for them. So, Thomas, please come up here and tell us a bit more about what to expect.
All right. Thanks, Sonja. I think I need to update my bio. I'm back in Brussels since last year. Anyway, hi everybody. Slow news day. I just wanted to say a couple of things. So indeed, I'm working on land use, but in fact, a lot of the work we do with the industry program, which is leading this event, is around this exact question of removing carbon from the atmosphere and doing it safely. And one of the things we're interested in making sure is that there's a proper governance a proper governance system in place to make sure that we don't end up putting a lot of carbon into the ground, whether it's through industrial means or through land use, in a way that's not permanent. So we're interested in seeing some kind of safe and dependable and permanent solution for carbon removal and carbon storage, but it really has to be those things. So what I'm really interested in this report is, okay, what are the policies and measures that could govern this, and what are the risks? I'm currently, as Sonja said, I'm currently working on land use, but when I started at DCF all those 11 years ago, it was actually on governance that I was working on, and we were interested in the EU's climate policy target, what the target looks like, how all the different instruments operate and interact with each other, and we're really wary about the risk of a lot of kind of crossover or mission creep or bleeding between targets and instruments, and so policy architecture is essential. This is definitely not an issue that I'm an expert in, so I'm going to leave that to the experts. But the things that I am interested in are risk. We're heading as a society towards some kind of vision and some kind of implementation of a vision, of climate neutrality. And we have to design that right. And this is one of the ways that if we don't design it right, it could have very significant risks. So I can't think of a better organization than UCA Institute to tell us about those risks and how we can govern them. We've worked with the UCA Institute for many years, and we're really pleased to see this latest expert contribution to the policy debate. So the study, I will leave the authors to say more about it, but it's really helping us to understand what are the challenges associated with geological storage, what are the risks, and how do we manage those through smart policy design. I think I'll just leave it there. I really am really keen to hear the content, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. But once again, just want to thank the authors for this report, and to thank Corinna for organising this event. So, hand it back to you, Sonia.
Thank you. So we're going to hand over to Martin Kames from the UCA Institute to present the study. So one of the authors of the report, the lead author. Martin's been in the climate and energy business, research business for a long time. He's been headed up the climate energy division of the UCA Institute back since the mid-2000s. Has done an awful lot of work in all aspects of climate and energy policy. And he was originally an economist, so brings a dimension that I guess plugs into also the need for a business reality ultimately, also when it comes to CO2 storage. So we're going to hear from Martin. He's going to talk us through the study. We can open for a couple of, I guess, mainly clarification questions straight after that, and then Martin's going to join the panel as well. So if you do have more substantive questions, we can integrate those into the panel discussion. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Sonja, for the introduction, and thank you to the ECF for trusting in us to conduct the study and now to present I'm happy to present the results right now. And before we go to that, I think I also might need to correct, we didn't look into the economics of carbon removal or geological storage. The focus was on the risk and how to manage them. I think we may come to the questions in the panel discussion, but it's not a part of. I think there are hardly any euros mentioned in the study. Anyway, so I think most or many parts of the background are already mentioned. At least partly, there's a growing interest in terms of, with regard to carbon removals. The term is new, but I think the concept is, I think in the political discussion, but in the research domain, it's already, virulent a few more years. And it's basically the idea to move CO2 from the atmosphere through technologies or activities like Bio-CCS, biocarbon capture and storage, or direct air capture and carbon storage. But these CDR technologies are connected with geological storage, and the geological storage of CO2 is contentious. So the IPCC, I think we will see later a slide where we can see the amount which is expected in some of the scenarios, but all of the scenarios involve some level of CDR, particularly in the second half of the century. And then, on the other hand, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency in Germany, the UBA, also drafted or designed, compiled scenarios which also illustrate that climate neutrality can be achieved with bio-based removals only. So, but both, I think, and that's important, agree on the fact that this is only possible if there are deep emission cuts and immediately. And now, perhaps, with the new situation from today, elections, I'm not sure whether we are on track. I think we already achieved, we had last 30 months 1.45 degrees and temperature increased compared to pre-industrial levels. So as I said, IPCC and UBA agree on the fact that CDR will be required the more the later we start with emission reduction and the less we achieve through emission reduction. So nevertheless, I think they also agree that CDR should only be applied to hard to abate emissions and also to negative emissions. But nevertheless, with the upcoming discussions, I think the geological storage has received little attention in the last few years. So there was more attention 15 years ago when it was more discussed in the context of extending the lifetime of fossil power plants. But now we have the Paris Agreement, entirely different situation right now. So the study was funded, I think that was mentioned by the ECF, but it was also accompanied by several NGOs, by Can Europe, by EEB, by NABU, Friends of the Earth, I think, and by the WWF. So all that helped us as authors to draft the report and to improve the results, basically. So what you can see here is the scope. We first look into the geological storage and to some extent also CO2 transport. But we did exclude capture of CO2. That is a different storage. So just to know, we didn't look in more details into that. And then also, because the current discussion is on geological storage offshore. Of course, there are similarities between offshore and onshore storage, but since the current discussion is really on offshore, we didn't take into account the aspects of storage onshore. We looked then in the technological, geological, and environmental and socio-economic risks. This will be to some extent presented. We also sketched, I would say, a landscape of the position of policy stakeholders. We will skip that, but you can read it or look it up in the report, and you can see the QR code for the report. But what I will touch at least shortly is the existing policy landscape and what changes are required. And then also take a step back and have a kind of bird's eye view on the whole discussion on the governance of geological storage. And with that, then come to conclusions. The first thing is with regard to the risk, and I think the important thing to recognize here is that the risk profile has a certain shape. So the risk of, particular with regard to carbon leakage, increase during the injection phase, and then they come to a plateau. And throughout the time, I think the molecules will convert and will be fixed will mix with existing substances. Some of it's gradually held permanently in the rock pores by various forces known as trapping forces, and the immobile portions of carbon dioxide therefore increase over time. And that is important to consider that the operational phase is most important to ensure the risks. Just keep that in background. We have some other takeaway messages as well, but this is the first one. Then to ensure that there are risks are minimized or reduced, there are two phases where we need to look into particularly. The first one is the pre-injection site characterization, where we need to clear performance of the reservoir properties and conditions of the capacity, but then also on the pressure performance, and to determine what would be the fracture pressure, so that later in the second phase, the injection phase, the injection can be managed in a way that this fracture pressure is not achieved. So that it's always the fracture of injection is the pressure of injection is below that level. So, and important for that. Oh, sorry, I didn't. this is a slide to what I said right now. So here you can see the fracture pressure, and that it needs to be below the fracture pressure, what I mentioned. And important during the operational phase, and of course beyond the operational phase, is that you have a proper monitoring and can identify whether there is leakage, and then take corrective measures. So we also looked in existing projects. There are mainly two long-term projects which we have looked at. We have looked into others, but I only present those two here. One is Snøhvit in Norway. It's an offshore carbon storage project, and it's operational since 2008. And it turned out that there is unexpected subsurface storage behavior. And so there were immediate emergency wells which were then drawn or made. And also wells were unplugged and abandoned. So the important thing here is that the monitoring worked, and that in case of irregularities, the operator could address the situation, or so that no CO2 actually came to the atmosphere, that there no leakage occurred. The other consequences was, of course, that there a different layer of storage of the storage site was used, and that all induced higher cost, which were unexpected. But besides the significantly increased cost for elimination measures and intervention, no further effects are known so far. And I think it's over 10 years now that the CO2 is safely stored in that site. So it illustrates that I think on the one hand there is a risk with the technology, and I just mentioned one. We looked into more risks in that, environmental risks and other risks as well. So every storage site has its unique geological and technical setup. These risk factors need to be addressed upfront, and also the characterization methods are not foolproof. You need to be prepared for unseen events, and you need a comprehensive monitoring to identify all that. But I think what now is important with regard to geological storage is that you have a safe ramp up of the technology, that you can learn from existing and new projects and improve the risk assessment and risk management with that. So on the positive side, I would say it's not a positive or a zero risk technology, but compared to low risk technologies such as renewable energies, but with the decades of experience with CO2 injection, there are a lot of experience made, and also the experience have shown that risk can be addressed and managed. So looking into the next part I wanted to present is the governance structure, the existing governance landscape. We didn't look into international aspects of the governance, into European aspects, and then also with the example of Germany on the national aspects of governance and the existing structure. I don't want to present all the details, but look into just the two top regulations or directives of with regard to geological storage. This is a CCS directive and the ETS directive, which we looked into more detail. And you can see, I think, the main parts where we identified all in all, we would say both directives are a good basis to establish the technology and for the rollout and use of the technology. But there are some elements which should be addressed and should be improved. And these are mainly liability rules. They should be improved to ensure that financial resources are sufficient to deal with potential irregularities. I think this is currently not enough how it is regulated. And then rules for confidential reporting of irregularities, something like whistleblowing. So we do have the same regulation for the oil and gas industry. And since it is to some extent a similar technology, it would be appropriate, we think, to have the same approach for these technologies for geological storage as well. Stepping a little bit back, so having said that I think it's a good basis for further development of the technology. But if you look a little bit from a higher perspective, higher level on the whole thing, then we have three issues identified which need to be taken into account. The first one is trust in the technology and the companies and operators involved. The second one is existing experience with long-term risks. And the third one is the polluter, which we call the polluter pays principle. And based on these three more general challenges, we also put into question what would and should be the degree of government involvement. But I will explain it a little bit in more detail in the next few slides. So, unlike renewables, geological storage is a highly complex industrial technology that can only be implemented at large scale. So it's different than a wind power plant or a PV system which can be put on the roof by individuals or by homeowners. And the second point here is the know-how for storing CO2 is with the existing oil and gas industry. But the oil, and it's hardly impossible to consider to do a rollout of geological storage without that experience of the existing companies in the oil and gas industry. But on the other hand, I think this is from a trust perspective important. Existing oil and gas industry contribute to a large extent to the climate crisis. And they made large profits from a business model which caused the climate crisis. And then, of course, you can raise a question whether these companies can be trusted to contribute to saving or to solving the climate crisis. Should they again make profits from that? At least it's something, a serious question which plays a role if we put all the three challenges together. The next one is experience with long-term storage. So here also examples from Germany. If you talk about eternity cost of hard coal mining, operators have transferred the responsibility for these eternity cost to a foundation. AG Stiftung is a foundation. And actually, it's kind of a way to transfer the responsibility of companies to the government. The same with nuclear waste. That was in 2017. The responsibility for the nuclear waste was also transferred from operators in Germany to the government. And with regard to lignite, brown coal, there's insufficient liability. So actually also in the last point, it's government who takes the responsibility for anything which is not addressed by the operators. And with carbon storage, then the CCS directive already says, okay, responsibility needs to be transferred at least 20 years after the end of the operational period. In Germany, it's 40 years, but nevertheless, so it's already established in the directive. So the conclusion here, in the long run, the risks are anyway with governments, and of course, you can ask why shouldn't they be involved from the beginning if it's in that way anyway. Last point, polluter pays principle, and that may be a little bit tricky. I mentioned that graph already. As you can see here, you have 4 different scenarios from the IPCC report, and they all involve different levels of CDR, of geological storage, or including geological storage. And I would mention in the black box, with larger overshoot requiring greater amounts of CDR. So I think I mentioned already the 1.45 figure for the current increase in temperature, that we are shortly before overshoot starts. And so it's very likely that we need larger amounts of negative emissions. But then with the negative emissions, I think there is a problem how to allocate these emissions. So it will be after the period when fossil energy is already phased out. Then there are no or hardly any emitters from the fossil industry. There may be some from cement or from hard-to-abate sectors. There may be perhaps also from agriculture. But they also have to deal with how to address their emissions, the residual emissions, the hard-to-abate emissions after 2050. And of course, they should be responsible for those emissions and offset them. But who would be responsible for those emissions, for the negative emissions? And in the end, we don't have any entity we can put the burden on, deal with that cost. And so it's probably the most likely case the federal governments or the federal budgets. And with that, of course, then the government also would determine which amount of negative emissions and geological storage should be achieved. And that depends on budgets. But the important thing is they will be responsible for that and will need to manage that in the future, particularly after achieving carbon neutrality in the longer run. So, having said that, it already supports the question to which extent governments should be involved in governing geological storage. And here I've presented a graph where is sketched how it's distributed over different countries. So it's not that all on one side, but we have countries which have a minimal involvement, so who are more, I would say, laissez-faire or whatever, or more economically liberal, have a liberal approach. But then on the other right-hand side, you have also countries who have full control of the carbon storage. And in the middle, there are also countries from Europe, like United Kingdom and Denmark, who have kind of a hybrid approach where you do have some involvement of the government. And actually, there is also considerations in UK to establish a separate, at least suggestions, I would say. Maybe it's not in the political domain, but there are entities and NGOs who are suggesting that, to have a governance body who really addresses the demand and manages also carbon storage, geological storage, not necessarily operates. So it still would involve the operation, and that is perhaps illustrated in the next slide by entities who are familiar with that. But at least the government could be responsible for that. And so I said that we talk about the trust with existing industry who would be probably operation or could operation geological storage. There could be for example, an European body who is responsible for managing geological storage, being responsible for the risks, for the long-term risks of that, but then also for determining the level of geological storage which is required in Europe, for example, determining which is the level of hard-to-abate emissions and which levels of negative emissions do we need. And finally, this agency, or national governments as well, if it's not a central agency, could task operators to actually conduct to the geological storage. And this could be done through contracts for difference, so that there is a competition between different companies in order to ensure that there is minimal subsidies for these technologies. So it won't work on its own in the long term, but the idea is at least to think about how it could be managed. So our conclusions here, to sum up, I think it's the second last slide. We think there are regulatory and technical framework has, this is one of our conclusions. I didn't mention it before, but if you looked into the governance, and we also talked to operators, and they say, okay, the purity, different purity standards at national level, then also with different phases of the geological storage, so with abatement, with capture, with transport, and then also with storage. This causes confusion, and we need a process really to harmonize that. So that is the first. Then also confidential reporting of irregularities. I mentioned that whistleblowing could also increase the trust. We have operational challenges in terms of proper site selection and injection protocols, but also looked into the reuse of existing infrastructure, and we think it bears risk that usually is not appropriate to use existing infrastructure. In terms of environmental and safety risks, we looked into CO2 leakage, noise, and increased traffic. So I think also indirect effects are important. We think they are relatively, comparatively low, but they must not be ignored. And last but not least, on monitoring and liability, we need a continuous monitoring during and after operation, and last but not least, financial provisions. I mentioned that for remediation and maintenance need to be improved. And that leads me to the recommendations and the last slide here. We need a common set of standards which would reduce uncertainties and operational cost, and also foster and encourage cross-border collaboration, but at the same time also reduce the risks involved with transport, capture, transport, and storage of CO2. We also suggest to have independent third-party verification, both in the monitoring, but also in the site selection process. That would also improve the transparency and the acceptability or trust in the technology. We think the expanded environmental assessment is important to include indirect effects, for example, through additional traffic, ship traffic in the ocean. What also is important, I think there is already a spatial planning, but for the use of the territory, the offshore territory, we have different uses for protected areas, but then also for wind, fisheries, shipping, and so forth. And I think the important thing here is also not to look at only national approaches, but also include European approaches, because that could facilitate larger capacities and improve the use on the one hand, but also the safety of the technology. Post-closure financial liability, ensure that financial provisions for post-closure evolving risk and remediation are addressed. And last but the second last, government involvement. I think public trust is important, and that could be managed through a different approach in terms of how governments are involved. But I think it's a larger discussion, and the idea here is only to trigger the discussion and have considerations, pros and cons on that. I think the study was beyond the scope of the study to really recommend a clear approach here. But I think it's the study already illustrates that it's important to look into that. And last but not least, this is an evolving technology. We talked about learning by doing. This is important, and therefore, of course, all policies have to be reviewed and adapted to a new both challenges but also new insights how the risk can be reduced. So while reducing greenhouse gas emission remains a top priority, so geological storage is only for residual emissions, for hard to abate emissions or for negative emissions. It can contribute to achieving and maintaining the climate neutrality goal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. A very nice run through the study. And yeah, it's great to have the highlights there. There's a lot in there, and having your sort of highlights is a different version again to what you'd probably read if you read the whole study or the executive summary. Are there any immediate questions? I had one very quick one, and then I'll invite the panel up, which was just a question on, so you mentioned everyone involved in the study, and there's obviously a whole coalition of NGOs. Did you get any input directly from industry as well, either through review or, I don't know, some of the workshops you did? Just because, as you yourself say, that's where a lot of this expertise lies.
Yeah. I think we had a lot of interaction with industries as well through the workshops, and you mentioned that, and then, of course, we still also had bilateral discussions in case when we had questions, for example, on the CO2 purity standards. So we have discussed with several operators of CO2 transport pipelines or capture, and that's what they all together agreed. So there is a confusion right now, and particularly on the European level. So we need a process. I think the process has already started, but it has to be continued, and there needs an agreement on these standards.
Okay, thank you. Let's get the panel up then. So Stephanie Hiesinger, Rachel Moore, Camille Maury, if you'd like to join us up here. And we prepared a couple of questions to put to you as well. Could we get the first of those up? So this is via Mentimeter. So you'll need a code to get into it, which is 39548003. And you can see it up there at the top of the screen. And this is something Martin mentioned probably quite early on. So where in the value chain lies the greatest technical risk of CO2 storage? Is it the transport stage, injection, or storage, the actual storage of the CO2 itself? And obviously, we haven't included capture here since that's beyond the scope of the study. So we'll leave that open a bit longer. Certainly what I took, I guess, from you, Martin, was your study, at least, or the research you've done, suggests that injection is where there is the greatest risk. Is that correct? Or is it more nuanced than that?
This is for the storage part. So, but we didn't actually assess between. I think the risks are different, and it's really difficult then to say which is the greatest risk. Would you determine that in accounts of amounts of damage done, or in amounts of casualties. We didn't look into that in detail, but I think within the storage there are several steps where are risks. So.
Okay. Okay. I'll give a quick intro to the panel, and then we'll get, I think, stuck in straight to your own reflections on the study and what it highlights. Stephanie Hiesinger joins us from the European Commission, where she's head of units for low carbon solutions, more specifically the research and deployment of low carbon tech. She was previously part of Timmermans' cabinet and has done a lot of work on the EU ETS prior to that within DG Klima. Rachel Moore, managing director and owner of Carbstrat. So she's a CCS or CCUS expert. Prior to founding Carbstrat, she was with the IEA, and she wrote the IEA CCUS handbook on CO2 storage resources and their development. Rachel Moore, Moore. And Camille Maury, Senior Policy Officer with the European team at WWF here in Brussels. She's also been working in the EU policy space for more than 8 years with a strong focus on climate, energy and sustainability, also on industrial transformation at EU ETS as part of that. So wanted to kick off, I think, by asking each of you, a reaction to what we've heard. Does the report confirm what you already knew or what you thought you knew? Are there any surprises in it? Is it reassuring? Is it disturbing in any way? What's your take? Stephanie, do you want to kick off, and I'll move across and take a seat?
Sure, very happy to do that, and thanks also for having me on this panel, and also for the presentation of, first of all, for the report itself, but also for the presentation that we just followed. Of course, I mean, well, on the building blocks, I think there are no surprises in this report. I would just really like to underline that also when you said, well, you know, we need CCS, CDR, so removals and CCS, of course. While that is fully in line with our analysis in the European Commission, it's fully in line with the industrial carbon management strategy that we put out in February this year, together with the analysis on the increased 2040 target, where indeed, you know, we know that we will need up to 50 million tons of CO2 injection capacity by 2030. That is also the target in the Net Zero Industry Act. But then going beyond 2030, we will need 280 million tons already captured per year, 250 million tons of that for storage. And then going even beyond that to 2050, we will need up to 450 million tons per year of CO2 captured. And that's the amounts about which we speak. I think it's always good to recall that also in the public debate, that this is something that we will have to do. If we want to reach climate neutrality, we will have residual emissions in our system, and we will simply have to deploy removals and also carbon capture solutions. That's why the Net Zero Industry Act already sets a target. You said a lot about trusting certain actors. Well, the obligation under the Net Zero Industry Act is with the oil and gas industry, because they have the geological knowledge in particular to get storage projects off the ground at this point in time. And that's also part, I was surprised you didn't mention it, but it's part of the story as well. We do not have an operational CO2 storage site in the EU. We have one in the EEA in Norway, but we don't have that in the EU. To counterbalance that, we have a lot of capture projects already coming forward. Also there I can give you some numbers. My team in the Commission also operates the Innovation Fund. We already have 18.6%, 18.6 million tons per year of capture that we fund from the EU Innovation Fund. That is matching the NZIA target I mentioned to 37% of that NZIA target already in terms of capture. But those installations look for storage. and they can find that at that point. Luckily, we also, with the latest results, we also have 4 storage projects under funding now. So things are improving, but it's really important to recall where we stand. In your report, you talked also about the political risk. And I'm mentioning NZIA specifically to address that question, is there a political risk? Because I don't really see this risk being so high. I mean, it is, you said in your introduction as well, 10 years ago we already spoke about it, not a lot has happened, but we see that dynamic now. It's happening, and the figures I just quoted are showing that the industry is more and more serious about it. We have this legal obligation for the oil and gas industry, so I think we are moving towards that. The European climate law has an explicit reference to negative emissions after 2050, so you know that landscape has changed. And because I've been asked to be short in my introductory words, but I want to say one thing, because the report is of course looking at the risks, but what I find very important in the public communication on CCS is that we also stress the opportunities, and because risk is a very broad term, there are lots of challenges linked to CCS, and I will not deny that. There's a technical feasibility, there's financial viability issues, there's a lot, of ground to be covered, and the industrial carbon management strategy addresses some of these challenges already, or tries, in particular when it comes to standard setting. But it is, in my view, really important not to enter into the debate about this being a too huge risk, because we will need that storage. We need to be open to the people, we need to be open to the public. It's a technology that is not yet widely developed. We need to, with any first-of-a-kind technology or new technologies, there are things that are not known that we will discover along the way. And then it's really about how to manage those risks, having structures and measures in place that will help us if things go wrong. But your example on the Norwegian, because it struck me really when you presented it, because yes, that project didn't go as planned, but you seem to conclude from it that this is why the technology is risky, which I think is not the right conclusion. I mean, just to say, building a tunnel sometimes goes wrong. There's a very prominent example in Germany because the ground and the geology was not appropriate. But we don't conclude from that building tunnels is a very risky, and I always fear that the public, when it comes to CCS, also drawing conclusions on, nuclear waste storage. We're not talking about the same thing. I'm storing nuclear waste has completely different risks, of course, than storing CO2, which is again, it is not without challenges. But if the CO2 goes into the atmosphere, we're back to the situation that we currently have, and that we all want to address. So, and I think it's quite important to say that. Sorry for being a bit long.
May I have a quick? Yeah. No, sorry. Yeah, I fully agree with you, and I think the intention was exactly to illustrate what you now said, so that managing the risk was possible, and that therefore I wouldn't overestimate the risk. So I fully agree with you. Maybe I didn't get it across as I wanted to, but I agree with you.
Am I on? No? Oh, what have I done? Sorry, is that? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me today. Really appreciate it. By background, I'm a geochemist. So I've been working in the CCUS space in various capacities as a geo for many years. And the reason why I bring that up is because when we talk about risk, we're talking about two different things: impact and probability. And a risk can have a very, very low impact and a very high probability, which makes it acceptable. Equally, using the example of nuclear waste, a risk can have a very, very, very low probability, but a very high impact of effects. When we talk about risk, we need to make sure that we're understanding that we're discussing impact and probability together. And I appreciate how the authors went through this in their report. I think that was done very well. I will say, as someone who has had to write a report on CO2 storage, we have to make sure that we are technically accurate, because one of the things I found when I was reading the report, with all due respect to the authors, is that there are inaccuracies on the geology that allow it to be very widely criticized. And that is something that I've seen in a number of reports. It is not a criticism of the authors. It comes down to an understanding of what CO2 storage is, but more importantly, an understanding of what geological uncertainty is. If you were to talk to someone who works in the subsurface, a surprise in the geology would not be something that they would be surprised about. When we talk about geological uncertainty, it's this big question. No one really understands what we mean. So I've put together an analogy, and I'm sorry it might take a couple seconds to go through it. You are looking to buy a 2-bedroom apartment, and you are looking through all of the ads, but of course there's no pictures because you're just looking based on descriptions. You find one, you think it's great. It's on the 3rd floor of a 50-story building. You go to see a viewing, you enter somehow, we're not going to get into that, it gets too complicated, and you are escorted to the roof because you can't see this 2-bedroom apartment. On the roof, you're handed a whole bunch of blurry floor plans. They're not crisp, they're not clean, and you're escorted to a tunnel that looks all the way down into that 3-bedroom apartment or 2-bedroom apartment or 1-bedroom apartment. You're not sure because you can't see the floor plan. You can see it, but you can't really understand it. You're told, okay, you can send cameras, sensors, etc. down that tunnel, gather whatever information you want. There's some other tunnels on the roof that go into other floors. You can look at all the material that came out from when they constructed those tunnels. It's all laid out on the roof, so you'll see little tiny pieces of floor with big spaces in between where there were rooms. One tunnel ended up drilling straight through 45 floors of concrete. This is the information you're working with to decide whether or not you're buying this 2-bedroom apartment. You can talk to the neighbors to see how their experience was with the builders of similar buildings. You can find out what they're hearing. You can look at what their apartment's blurry floor plans look like, but you cannot enter that apartment at all. Would you buy it? This is what subsurface uncertainty and geological uncertainty is. You can never enter a reservoir 1,000 meters below your feet. You can use seismic scans, the blurry floor plans. You can drill into it and construct wells, the tunnel. The material that's on the roof is your cores. You can send sensors down, which is wireline logging, talking to nearby neighbors, getting operator experience in the same reservoir structure or nearby reservoir structures. But you will never know the color of the walls. You will never know the finishings. Yes, we know, for instance, with Sleipner, there was a zone that was more porous that they didn't expect. It doesn't mean that they did not de-risk that site and characterize that site with the best ability they could to a level that was acceptable for both the operator and the regulator. Geological uncertainty is a fact of life. It introduces risk, but it is risk that can be managed with site-specific risk management plans, dynamic risk assessment, and it is a combination of the operator/site developer and the regulator to move forwards on this. One of the things that was called to attention with the study is the need for real-time monitoring. That is happening at every single operational storage site today. We need to make sure that when we're talking about these sites and what is needed, that conclusions aren't replicating what's already being done, because it looks like regulators and operators aren't requiring that. So sorry if I got a little bit on a soapbox. It's a bit of a difficult day. I am American. But when we talk about risk, especially in the context of CO2 storage, we need to make sure that we're communicating it in a way that's understandable, because I speak to the general public a lot. People don't realize that an aquifer isn't empty space with flowing water. And these are the kinds of things that we need reports like this to answer, to be from trusted organizations, but we also need to make sure that we are bringing the people in who have the operator experience and not demonizing the communities that have spent years and years and years in the subsurface. They will need jobs in the future too. So that's kind of my key takeaways, and sorry, that went over time.
Good afternoon. Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for having me. I know it works, yeah? All right. Okay. Yeah, I also think like the timing could not be more right to have such conversation among like very different actors. I'm just thinking that right now we are all listening to commissioners' hearing in the European Parliament this week and also next week, and I have no doubt that the topic of carbon capture and storage will come up during one or even like several of those hearings. As WWF, we really welcome the opportunity to reflect on the key findings from the ECO studies. I think there is a dedicated chapter on the NGO's views exactly on carbon capture and storage. But if I may, I would like to emphasize a few things. So as an environmental organization, we look at CCS technology obviously with caution, as you can imagine, given both the environmental and societal risk linked to the deployment of the technologies, from the capture, the transport, but also the storage of CO2, as explained actually within the studies, but also due to timing and cost. And I think that's what is also very relevant here. If you look at timing, if you look at IPCC models, you will see that, of course, right now, all models and pathways to reach climate neutrality showcase CCS, but you also have to take timing in time, like when we will need CCS technologies and also CDR in more like general. And if you look at the timing, it's actually very much, I guess, related to the cost right now and what is available, because looking back at solutions that already exist, like renewable deployments, for instance, renewable energy, you will see that the costs have really decreased in the last decade. And right now, the major, let's say, bottleneck with CCS is obviously cost. So how we make sure that we continue to have the deployment of renewable energy that we need, like for like reducing emission at source, because that's the first priority we should have, as actually was also mentioned by Martin earlier. But in the meantime, we look at how to reduce also the cost for some CCS projects and SP technologies when it's needed. So really, I think as an organization, as an environmental organization, what we would like to stress is actually to look at where is CCS needed for what type of emission we will need CCS. So it was clearly mentioned that it would be for residual emission. In our views, it should be actually for residual emission only in certain sectors. So for sectors that have no other ways to decarbonize. In my mind, I have like, for instance, cement. And in the meantime, we should really look at for what sector it really doesn't make sense. And that's why we would welcome basically a map out of where we will need this technology to be deployed. And we would also like to see a clear definition of like CCS and also of CDR, because at the moment there is clearly a confusion in the public also of what are removals compared to abatement technologies. So that would be very much welcome, and maybe that's also what we will expect from, let's say, the next political mandate. If I go back to the key findings of the report and what we would like to outline, I think there are several things. First, the infrastructure issue. It's quite clear from the report that right now we have an issue with the transport. especially when it comes to the safety of the transport. So I would be happy to discuss that as well. What do we do with the current gas grid? Is it exploitable or not? Or should we need more infrastructure? Because then it's the question of how we finance those infrastructure. Then the storage capacity for offshore storage, that's very important for us as WWF. We really appreciate the recommendation to look at having spatial planning in mind. So really look at where we should have those sites and having these no-go areas. I think it's a very welcome finding, at least on our end. And so that's why we wanted to link it with strong safeguards. So obviously permanence and safe storage are key components of this debate. So, and really to finalize, because I know we need to be short, I also think like the governance issue, but also the public acceptance, as just mentioned by other panelists, is also very key. As we go forward, I think it was Thomas who mentioned that we need a clear vision on how we want to decarbonize and achieve climate neutrality on time. I also think we need the public acceptance to do so. And that's why really talking to the public early on is very important. And I cannot really emphasize this enough. I think it will be key for whatever we design, and especially for such technologies, because your metaphor was very interesting. I also think that it's very difficult for the public to grasp what this technology is. So the more we can talk about it, but also not underestimate the risk, because there are some risks. So just to be honest with also the risk and explain how we can tackle them, I'm sure the public will appreciate.
Great. Thank you all. I think what you've all mentioned is risk. So there is some risk, and Rachel, you're suggesting that there's always going to be some risk when you go subsurface. We can manage that risk. However, if there is risk and we want to manage that risk, presumably that does entail a cost of some sort. And as you just pointed out, Camille, CCS is already an expensive endeavor that we're trying to make a business case for. So I guess my follow-up question is to you, Rachel, but also to others. Out of the specific recommendations in the report to manage that risk, parts of it that can be managed, which ones do you sign up to? So this is things like third-party verification, for example, and then as you just said, the report itself says we shouldn't look to reuse existing infrastructure. That's okay, fine, but that's also going to raise the costs, for example. So maybe if you can kick off, Rachel, and others can jump in, but if we take the very specific recommendations, which ones, and from the Commission's, I don't know how much you can say, but perspective too, what are the ones that we can go for? Are there new regrets? And are there ones where we say, well, we're going to, the costs are justified because we can't do it without?
So I would say actually a lot of the recommendations on risk specifically for storage are already built into the cost. Long-term monitoring is already built into the cost. This long tail liability, including transfer, that's one of the reasons why in Europe it costs so much. To be blunt, some of the projects that are in development right now are looking at project killing upfront costs because of the way that financial security is required to be turned over, and the amount of financial security, even though it has now been migrated to a risk-based approach, the amount of financial security you need to put up before you have started to decommission your offshore platform is enormous. The costs specifically on characterization, on reducing risk through monitoring, those are business as usual for storage sites. That is built in there. The cost when we talk about transport, I was very, very happy to see the report's findings about repurposing. In Europe, there has been a very robust encouragement around repurposing infrastructure for CO2 and hydrogen transport. When I speak with operators, the main thing they tell me is we will take the routes, we will rip out the pipeline, and we will put in new pipes. Because while that is a cost, well, you can recycle the pipe, it's actually in the long run more well, very likely cheaper for them to put in a fit-for-purpose pipe with fit-for-purpose infrastructure than it is for them to repurpose and introduce the risk of corrosion or things like that. There are discussions about running a pipe through an existing pipe because it's actually technically possible, but your diameters aren't compatible. So very, very happy to see this discussion on is the transport infrastructure we have reusable? It depends on your definition of reuse. Also, in certain cases, it is actually reusable to transport CO2 in gaseous form, much lower throughputs, but that doesn't have the same technical considerations as if we're moving supercritical. So I think that's where I would go.
I very much agree with a lot of what you said, and in particular on the last point, and I'm of course also always more coming from the regulatory perspective, but we need to bear in mind that by now the capture installation, so the industrial installation, but also the CO2 transport and the storage side are EU ETS installations, which means in case of a leak, they are all liable under the EU ETS. And that adds to the cost or the potential cost. And that's why I also always hear that in terms of infrastructure, there's a preference actually to build it new and not rely on old infrastructure because it gives you more guarantees in that respect. But maybe also what Rachel said earlier, there are indeed a number of findings in the report that are already addressed, and you also mentioned it yourself. CO2 standards, in particular for transport, is something that is foreseen as an action in the industrial carbon management communication, and where work is currently ongoing. But also, for example, you mentioned as an operational challenge proper site selection. We heard about spatial planning, but well, de facto, proper site selection is a prerequisite for obtaining a permit under the CCS directive. So there's no way around it. The European Commission has oversight. Of course, you know, there are draft permits that need to be published by the competent authorities. So also there, you know, the transparency is actually there. When it comes to site selection and spatial planning, also the industrial carbon management communication foresees that we will have a storage atlas for the EU, which is designed to be some kind of investment atlas, of course, to kind of see where are the industrial clusters that will capture CO2 and where are potential storage sites nearby. But it will also allow member states spatial planning in that regard, and it will facilitate site selection as well. Maybe also on the monitoring and the long-term liability, and I think Rachel also already said it. Well, in particular the financial liability, that is also already required in the CCS permits. You have to have a regime, and it is indeed the case that storage projects are afraid of us ramping up upfront costs at this stage because costs for CCS are quite high through those rules, and we need to be careful and balance that, of course. And one risk that I also, or risk or challenge, as I prefer to call it, that I very much agree with, is actually that we need capacity in member states' competent authorities, because you know it's very often you have authorities that deal with all kinds of permits for all kinds of uses, but and I think Rachel demonstrates that very well on this panel. You need specific knowledge for being able to grant those permits, and it's not new because we all have oil and gas exploration, and there is knowledge there, but the competent authorities also have to be staffed accordingly, in my view.
It's a good point. Is that working? Yeah, Martin, I wanted to give you a chance to respond. So, I mean, at least some of the panelists are saying that it's a great report, but a lot of this is already happening. That's the good news.
Exactly, yeah. I think we didn't invent the wheel from the scratch, or so it's already there, and we agree to that. And I think the main message was already say, okay, the CCS directive and the ETS together are a good basis for that, and to develop the technology. I still have some slightly diverging views on some of the aspects. I think the long-term liability is still, this is our assessment, is is still too weak in order to address long-term risks there. And our detailed recommendation was that they should be addressed through CO2 allowances, basically. So because they would also increase in the price if the price is increasing. So you would have an implemented strategy to also cover potential risk of different price developments. So if you really need to set back allowances as a security, then have a different situation as if you have a determined amount of what is to be set back as a security. In terms of special planning, I agree with you. I think most of these issues are already addressed. I think the idea here was also to have, currently it's basically a national approach. So all the member states are doing their own special planning. And I think there should be a coordination which could increase both safety and also the facilitate the use of storage capacities. And last thing I just want to get back to is demonizing existing operators. I don't think that's demonizing. So in the end, we also say, okay, they will be required. Yeah, Rachel, you mentioned that.
For the record, I wasn't saying that the report itself did, but it is language that comes off quite well.
Yeah, but I think it's important to recognize that there is the language quite often, and I think we need an approach to address that, and not just say it's not there and it's not appropriate, but to take these discussions seriously and then let's look at it. And I think some of that is also which responsibility which operator or which entity has. And there, I think there could be adjustments in the future, and that is a recommendation here to have a proper discussion on that. So I think there is no way to apply or implement carbon storage without existing operators. I fully agree with you, but still the setting, how they operate, under which conditions in terms of profits and so forth, could be different. Thank you.
Yeah, and then we'll see if there are any questions in the room.
Just if you allow me to react to one point that you just mentioned. I think he's putting it on stream, no? Just because on this idea to set aside ETS allowances, just one comment, because I have a bit of experience with the EU ETS, and well, the cap is going down, and it's going down quite rapidly. And by the time we will need CCS more, you know, that's a bit of a since we will need more CCS towards, I don't know, 2040. I mentioned the numbers and beyond. And then the cap is going down. It's actually maybe not a good idea to set aside ETS allowances for liability when, you know, they will be scarce in the future. So, and maybe one comment also on the suggestions before that we should identify sectors. And I know, of course, where this comes from and what the fear behind it is. But I'm always thinking, okay, I prefer to talk about hard to abate emissions, because that is what really matters. Emissions that can either not be reduced or are too costly, that can also be to be reduced in the future. But we don't know at this point what developments we will see in industries. And I think what we may consider today as hard to abate may not necessarily be hard to abate in a few years from now. And I think we should leave that a bit open, you know, and not define sectors that benefit from it, but have a more general approach to it and say, okay, hard to abate is what we are aiming at, and rather than, you know, locking us in. And for now, I think the differential in costs is still, you know, quite a safety net in terms of, I mean, using CCS for power sector emissions, and so it's still much more interesting to invest in renewables rather than going for the CCS option there.
very quick. Can I just see if there are questions just before? Just to know, yes, here and here. So 2. Okay, if you come back and then, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, so I just want to say I agree with you. And for the record, I have never worked for any extractive industry. But the reason why I brought that up, in fact, is because I'm relatively young. I finished my geo degrees, decided not to go into extractive industries. We need a lot more people going into the subsurface. And the dialogue that we see around certain extractive industries is not as nuanced as it should be. It is fair in many cases, especially on some of the governance issues. It is fair in many cases on some of the profits in certain jurisdictions. But we need to make sure that we are not alienating the people who are coming up away from learning about the subsurface, because we can't do any of the storage of hydrogen or water or geothermal or CO2 or as you go without that knowledge.
Okay, can we take the 2 questions and then I come to you first? Floor, have we got a microphone? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and just tell us who you are.
Hi, Aymeric Command from the Zero Emissions Platform, ZEP. Thank you for the report and the presentation and the panel today. I had a question about the costs again. So you've all sort of touched upon the role of CCS to achieve net zero and addressing hard-to-abate emissions, but also the high costs involved and its links with the evolution of prices under the ETS, which I appreciate. But I wonder if you had any views to share, all of you, about the role of private finance as well and how to leverage that kind of finance and not just public subsidies and possibly EU funds. Thanks.
Okay, can we move the microphone, sorry, can you move the microphone up here, and then we'll take a 3rd question as well, and then come back first to Camille.
Hello, my name is Katarina Fay from NABU, and my question is to the definition of hard-to-abate emissions and the emissions to be allowed or to access CCS infrastructure. You said you are against the hard definition due to the fact that we have technological development and we will see what it means to be hard to abate in the future. Would a cyclical review of such a definition be an option to enable societal acceptance by saying we are only allowed for hard to abate sectors with an open review every X years?
Okay, and if you pass the microphone along, we'll make that the final one in this round. Yeah.
Yes, I will be quick. Maria Maggiore, Investigate Europe. I have a question perhaps for the Commission. Have you made any estimation of the kilometers of pipeline that need to be built to create a network of CO2 transport around Europe, and eventually the cost for that as well?
Okay. Camille, then. You can pick up on any of those 3 or come back on the previous.
Yeah, I will maybe pick up on the question from Emric also on the how to actually have private financing CCS project. As you can imagine, as an NGO, it's actually also something that we would like to see. I mean, there were various reports already out there about the number of few funds dedicated to CCS projects that so far didn't see the light. I'm thinking of the ETS Innovation Fund. I think the 4th call was just out last month, actually. So, which give actually the number, the exact number. I don't remember exactly the magnitude, but it was quite high on like how much allowances are not dedicated into the ETS Innovation Fund that are financing CCS project. I think there was a Court of Auditors report also a long time ago explaining the different EU funds going towards CCS projects. So, I mean, we would be all also for having maybe private finance more directed to it, especially when you look at what's going to happen with now the review of the MFF. So trying to look at, okay, where finance is going to go, especially with all the other things that we need to finance with public resources. And maybe going back to the hard to abate definition, because here I think it's very interesting. Already in Europe, we see a lot of differences in what we considered hard to abate sectors, especially in industry itself. itself. In Europe right now, we can also see that maybe steel can be considered no longer hard to abate because of the different pathways that we can have for the steel sector. And maybe CCS is actually not a real good option for decarbonizing the steel industry. There are studies out there that show that the capture rate, if you apply CCS to a blast furnace, is very limited, and it's not, it's not worth it, basically, to put it this way. So I would be also interested in seeing like, it's not like a definition of what is hard to abate, but better like a prioritization then of CCS use when it comes to where it should be used, because it's unavoidable. Like we have no other solution to decarbonize such industry, for instance.
Okay, thank you. Probably gonna invite Stephanie to go next. So you can come back on the private finance, I suppose, question as a complement to any public finance, but specifically also on the, hard to abate. Maybe a comment on the idea of a prioritization. In any case, the idea of having a definition and then a periodical review. And do we have an estimate of the numbers of kilometers of CO2 pipelines we need and an associated cost at this stage?
Maybe I take this last question on the infrastructure first. I have to admit that the CO2 infrastructure is firmly in the hands of my colleagues in DG Energy, and there is an estimate, but I don't recall the number. And I see the colleague from ZEP having it. It's of course quite a number. But indeed, I remember having seen a presentation recently on the kilometers needed. I cannot recall right now, but pretty sure we find it somewhere on the Commission's website. I'm sorry for that. Then I didn't want to trigger a whole debate on do we need a definition or not, but I just think, how can I say that? I'm always wondering how useful the definition is, and what is the purpose of having it defined, and also the question of priority access to certain sites. At this point, I'm not sure we are there because, as I said, we don't have an operational storage site. So I think the issues that we need to address are much bigger. And as you just said, there are industrial applications that are looking into CCS as an option, but it's not viable. And I think that will determine in the end what will go to the storage, yes or no. But we're not in a situation where we have abundant storage and people will just simply ship their emissions there, even though they could just also at a relatively manageable cost reduce those emissions. That is not the case we're in, and that's why I don't rule out anything, but I don't think that is our current priority.
You want to come back?
Cool, yeah. Sorry. I'm just going to give you the figure. That way you have it on mic as well for the online participants. The exact figure is between 6,700 to 7,300 kilometers by 2030, and between 15,000 to 19,000 kilometers by 2050 for the entire CO2 infrastructure network, transport network.
Is there a price tag on that too?
There is.
Okay.
The deployment of those exact same figures, so roughly 7,000 kilometers by 2030 and double that, actually a bit more than double that by 2050. Cost roughly between 6.5 to 19.5 billion by 2030, and between 9.3 and 23.1 billion by 2050. It's in the JRC report published on the Commission's website. There's two reports. The last one came out just before the Pau ICM forum in Pau.
Thank you. Much appreciated to have support in the audience. No, but I didn't address that question on the financing. So maybe because I mean, of course, it needs to be a mix as usual. It will not all be financed by the public. The Innovation Fund, indeed, the last call came out, the results came out 2 weeks ago, and we are funding already quite a number of CCS projects, as I said before, 18.6 million tons per year of capture. But yeah, also the Net Zero Industry Act, with an obligation on the oil and gas industry, will make sure that there are investments in storage sites happening, and that is not going to be publicly financed in that regard. So I think that's where we crowd in, different sources. And Rachel said it very well. I think there's an industry also looking for maybe a new business case to be developed, because oil and gas production, the more we move towards climate neutrality, may also, lose its current business case.
So since I've been sort of the industry person on this, despite the fact that I don't work for industry, I will point out actually that I applaud the Commission for the Net Zero Industry Act storage obligation. It is a imperfect execution of a carbon take-back obligation or carbon storage obligation, which is a sort of very complex but very elegant way to put the burden on extractive industries to mandate that they take back over time the amount of carbon that they produce. And I'm going to specifically say extractive industries here because it needs to apply to all of them. It cannot just be put on the oil and gas sector. There are other industries that are producing geological carbon. Cement, coal, some of the mining sectors. And on top of that, when we look at a storage obligation or a carbon take-back obligation, we need to make sure that it ramps up in a way that is realistic with what is needed in terms of the timeline to assess the resources, but also to permit and construct the projects. Because what I'm hearing from a number of different sources is that the NZ is great, but actually they can't get a project permitted and constructed by 2030. And so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg there. Even if industry wants to invest, it may still fall short of that obligation.
Okay, can I just get a sense of, are there more questions? Or not for the moment? Okay, we had 2 more questions we wanted to put to you. And I appreciate we're already a couple of minutes over time, so maybe we'll put those 2 out to you. One's on standards. Do we need a standard, an EU standard? One of the report's recommendations, and the other one is on do we want more government involvement? So and then I'll come back to the panel, and maybe in a closing round you can give a comment on each of those 2 specific recommendations, and then we'll wrap up. So this is back via Mentimeter. So if we could can we get the first of those 2 questions up? We'll just do them back to back. Or, well, depending on how much time people need to vote, we can do one and then the other. Do we need EU standards for CO2? And I guess it's purity. That's the primary recommendation here. Yes, we do. No, we don't. Or no, we don't. We've got national standards, and those are perfectly adequate. Or perhaps you've got no idea, for which you can go for the don't know option. And maybe it makes sense to them one by one. So not everyone needs to comment, but let's leave it open. I think Martin, you made a clear recommendation. Yes, we need them. Does everyone? Maybe it's simplest just to ask. Does everyone agree? Yes, we need an EU standard for purity.
We're working on it for CO2 transport. So
Rachel?
It needs to be on the basis of material science, health and safety. It does not need to be on the basis of what is needed for liquefaction or shipping, because we have to make sure that it's technology neutral as technology develops for the future.
Okay. Stephanie, can you confirm that you are working in line with those requirements?
Don't pin me down on the latest discussion, but we're working still on defining those standards, of course.
Okay. So we seem to have a general consensus on that. Let's go to the next question then, the final one. Should governments get more involved in CO2 storage? And again, Martin laid out a case for this. Various suggestions too of what that kind of involvement could mean in future. It could mean we have a European storage body, for example, that gets involved in site selection, that gets involved in accrediting verifiers, that gets involved in MRV. Could governments own and operate storage sites in their entirety rather than inheriting them 20 or 40 years down the line? Could it be a source of revenue for governments going forward? How involved basically do we want governments to be? Okay, everyone who's answered that question says yes. I'm conscious that governments, obviously, we've also heard, don't necessarily have the expertise to do all this, so inevitably it would be a partnership. But yeah, interested to hear the panel's views. Is it also a resounding yes, and if so or not, what kinds of greater involvement would make sense from your point of view? Stephanie?
The whole panel is looking at me.
That's because you're the only one holding the microphone.
Yeah, it's true, it may be my fault. No, but well, should governments get more involved? I think, of course, it always depends at what level. First of all, we need to realize as well that there are some member states in the EU where CCS is still not allowed. So, I mean, then should that government get more involved? Yes, because it will mean... Well, Germany is changing. Well, Austria is about or had a public consultation on it, so there is some change happening. But I mean, if you want to talk about Germany, I mean, the strategy is on offshore. We're not talking about onshore. So, you know, this is, I mean, should governments get more involved also to bring that really, that topic on the political agenda? Definitely yes. But then there is also, of course, a lot of government involvement already foreseen in the CCS directive. And that's what I mentioned before when it comes to administrative capacity. That needs to be built. So there also more involvement is needed, more resources to become available would definitely be desirable. Because the challenge is clearly out there. So.
Just one quick follow-up, because you mentioned the CCS directive. In your view, does that need updating at all?
Well, you know, the CCS directive is already a number of years old, but it also, you know, again, we don't have any operational storage site, so we just updated the guidelines under the CCS directive, and we see the first cases coming our way. So to say it needs an update without it having been applied is a bit premature in my view. So I think let's, you know, gather some experience, and then we can have that discussion. But well, one thing in the report, it says we need a European body. I think, well, the European Commission, my team in particular, is currently acting as such a body. So I don't know, I'm not someone who immediately likes to call for new institutions. You know, also there, I think we should have a bit of a measured approach and see, you know, what works, which responsibilities are taken by the member states, which are taken at the European level, and then we take it from there.
Yeah, okay. Camille, Rachel, and then we can end with you, Martin. That's okay.
Yes, now about government involvement, I was also thinking, if I'm not mistaken, there is a requirement in the Net Zero Industry Act for member states to map out the storage capacity by the end of this year, right? So obviously some of you member states will be involved in that, at least I hope, because again, it goes back also to the public acceptance. I think the more involvement we have at national level, the more we can map out where storage is available, and also how to make it work and limit the environmental risk.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I will call to attention that the only storage site in Europe post-FID is technically government because it's 3 state-owned enterprises. So I was surprised that the Netherlands is not really involved, given that Porthos is state-owned. Governments have a couple different things. We need more regulatory capacity. We can't permit because we don't have enough governments with capacity to permit, even in the countries where the CCS directive does allow storage. We need the countries that it doesn't allow storage to update. Governments also should lead on pre-competitive exploration. They have done it before for almost every other natural resource. If they lead on pre-competitive exploration, they can manage their resources, define the spatial planning, The geology doesn't move. The geology, unfortunately, is fixed. You can't really move it around. We get some movement on offshore wind. We get some movement on photovoltaics and renewable energy, but your resources are your resources. So you need to know where they are so you can appropriately manage your net zero strategy and your spatial planning moving forwards.
Okay, thank you. Martin, what's your, I guess, your final takeaways?
Yeah, no, I think on the last discussion, in the end, I agree that government involvement is not the golden nail or solving every problem. So, and there are a lot of challenges with governments involved. You mentioned that. So, not all governments are currently involved in that. So, but nevertheless, I think particularly with regard to the volume of geological storage and how it would be financed, more involvement to determine the involvement, and then also how it should be financed, more involvement would be required also to get the technology going right now. So I think it could improve. And in this regard, I think a review of the CCS directive could even also contribute to make it more applicable. So it may be the current situation that it, in terms of development, not in terms of risk, is appropriate, but in terms of developing the technology, it may be could be improved. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much. Can we have a round of applause for our panel? And thank you those of you who joined us online, and those of you especially who joined us here in the room today. I guess my takeaway is we had a lot of consensus that the report is useful, points out a lot of risks or challenges, but it also seems to hit the ground running. Certainly one of what I took away from the panel was a lot of this is already underway. So if anything, it's a question of fine-tuning. It's not advocating a radically different direction that we have yet to launch into. And the main challenge remains to actually get this off the ground in a managed, sensible manner. Thank you. And join us for a drink.